Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Museum After Hours. I'm Trey Johnson, Assistant Director of Education and Outreach here at the Kansas Museum of History. We have an excellent program lined up for you all tonight. Sarah Deer will be talking about the Second Trail of Tears in the Muscogee Exodus to Kansas in 1861. Deer is an enrolled citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. She received her BA and JD from the University of Kansas and is currently a University Distinguished Professor at KU, where she's appointed in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department, as well as the Indigenous Studies program. Deer's presentation will follow a group of Muscogee people who sought to escape Confederate forces in 1861 by relocating to Kansas. Their journey is known as the Trail of Blood on Ice. Tonight, we will learn of the efforts of the Muscogee people, led by Chief Opothleyahola, to reach Fort Row during the harsh winter, ending in the deaths of around 2,000 Muscogee in southeast Kansas. After the program, we'll have some time to answer some questions, so be sure to use the Q&A feature or the chat to pose questions as they come to you, and we'll get to as many as we can. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Deer.
Hi there, thank you. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. Started. Okay, I hope that's showing up okay.
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Deer. As the intro indicated, I'm a citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, but I was raised in Kansas. I was raised in Wichita, Kansas. And so I've always been very interested in this story, even from a very early age. I came upon this topic kind of accidentally. I am not a historian. I want to make that clear, first of all. I am a lawyer, and so I have some skills in studying legal history, but I'm not a historian by trade. I decided I wanted to write a long law review length article about the history of Muscogee constitutional jurisprudence. And the Constitution that created the Supreme Court was post-Civil War. So I explored the decisions that the court made, the Creek Court made, what kinds of cases they took, what kinds of jurisdiction did they exercise. But I never really got to circle back to this story about Kansas and the Creek people. I should note that I'm saying Muscogee and Creek alternatively. I mean to refer to the same group of people. Creek was the English name given to the Muscogee, and so they were known both as Creeks and as Muscogee people. And although I am a citizen and an interested citizen, I do not speak at all for the nation or for the families of the folks we're going to be talking about. So it's almost like my hobby becoming a PowerPoint here. I'm excited to share some things with you, but the key book that you must have if you are passionate about this topic, or you find yourself afterwards, is the McBride book from 2000 called Opothleyahola and the Loyal Muscogee, Their Flight to Kansas and the Civil War. I have found this the most useful resource that I have found that tells this story, although I'm sure that there are discrepancies between historians on some of the particulars. But at any rate, this has been the book that I've used to learn the most, and it's got the footnotes that will take me in the direction to find, primary sources around this whole time period. So that would be the best recommended book at this point. There's a new one that came out that I haven't read yet. But it's important to remember that tribal cosmologies, the way Native people thought about themselves politically, was very, very different from the way sort of Anglo-American law identifies people in terms of their identity, their political identity, right? And so there was certainly a clash of cultures between the Muscogee way of life and the Euro-American, or what I'll just now call the Anglo-American systems of government. And you have to start with the knowledge that Muscogee people immediately most closely recognized with a clan, and that clan is mostly named for animals in the Muscogee Creek Nation, but there are others as well. And you receive your clan through your matrilineal side. So whereas sort of Judeo-Christian governments mandate that the surname of a child be the father's, it was actually the opposite in Muskogee history and still today. Then there was a household and a town, and sort of the last thing that people identified with was this Creek Confederacy. In fact, a lot of people just referred to their towns, their local communities, as a very decentralized people. But given the onslaught of European intrusions, this is going to change over time. But just to give you a sense of what the government looked like for a particular community, or what we would call a dulwa or a town, it was about 100 or 500 or so people, maybe 1,000. And there were 4 branches of government, if you think about it in this way, in the sense that there was a hereditary leadership called a miko, and the miko would be matrilineal heritage. This could be held by a man, and the English translated it to king, which suggested that the mikos had more power than they probably actually did. But at any rate, there was a hereditary component to the government. There was also a council of what were called the beloved men, who were very wise, were very old, and had great memories. And so they were officially a group within the government. There were Creek people that served in the military, and they also had a seat at the table. And then there were speakers and other folks that the Miko would come to ask to participate within the government when they needed really smart people. So there were branches of government, they just looked nothing at all like the US Constitution conceives of balance of powers. And what happened early on when the Europeans started coming is that the towns realized that they were very vulnerable because they were all spread out and sort of autonomous and didn't really communicate all that often with one another. And so there's debates on when this happened, but at some point there was a Creek Confederacy that was developed, and it met once a year early on, and ultimately, would have decision-making power over where the Creeks were going to side on a conflict, because there were many in this time period. So Creek people, along with the other what's called 5 tribes that were originally from the Alabama and Georgia region, is that the introduction of Western ways and the introduction of Western values and ideas began to create a schism in many tribes, where there was a faction of folks that really wanted to take advantage of this new capitalistic opportunity to look and act like a white government, to have a written language that was seen as being the most useful way to deal with these clashes. And there was another faction that really felt that they wanted to hold on to their old ways. They didn't want to buy into this sort of very white type of thinking and a way of running a government. And so they resisted these assimilation efforts. And some of them were inspired by Tecumseh, who many of you may have heard about in other contexts. But essentially, it kind of took on sort of geographical schisms. There was a huddle of creeks in the upper creeks and then the lower creeks, and they kind of started to polarize. This is again in the very, very early 1800s. And so this schism ends up being amplified over time, and that's where we get to Kansas. So there's a little bit of a journey here. There was, because of this long-standing tension, a civil war among the Creek people that lasted for about 2.5 years. And excuse me, Andrew Jackson was his claim to fame was his defeat of the traditional Lower Creeks. I'm sorry, the traditional Red Sticks, and he actually campaigned on the fact that his people killed about 5,000 Creek soldiers. So that was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. It got very complicated during the Civil War because the federal government was in their own war of 1812. It's a very long, complicated history with lots of battles, and there are full-length book treatments of this period. But I want to move ahead to the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which was Andrew Jackson's forced, cession of the Muscogee people to cede 23 million acres of their territory in Georgia and Alabama. And this applied to the entire Creek Nation, even to those who were loyal. And so this amplified divisions even further. So the lower creeks, again, that aligned more closely with assimilation and acculturation, sort of claimed victory as a result of this skirmish, or this long war, rather. And William McIntosh rose to prominence. And William McIntosh was the son of a Creek mother and a Scottish father. And in fact, a lot of times these mixed blood Indians that had the knowledge that came with a English-speaking white father, these sons and these daughters could work their way up into the leadership. They also started developing plantation economies and starting the process of chattel slavery for those plantations. And so this is the prominent Creek figure during this time period. Now, William McIntosh ended up being executed for treason in 1825. There was so much pressure, especially from Georgia, to move all of the 5 tribes west to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. And people dug their heels in and they said, we absolutely will not go. This is our homeland. We never agreed to sell it. We want to live here and we are not interested in moving to a foreign place. But William McIntosh was heavily involved in some shenanigans and ultimately took a major bribe and then signed away all the land east of the Mississippi. And so he was executed for treason in 1825. He had agreed in this treaty to move to Indian Territory. So there was a faction right after his execution that they took the money that he got from the bribe and they left for Indian Territory almost immediately. A lot of the other Creeks don't get to Indian Territory until the mid to late 1830s. And that's what I want to talk about next. We also have to remember that during this removal period that most people know as the Trail of Tears, we're looking at Andrew Jackson as president. And remember, he sort of campaigned on his prowess over the Creek soldiers as one of his selling points to be on the ticket. And so in his very first annual message to Congress, he said, we have to move these tribes west of the Mississippi. He couched it in sort of benevolent terms, right? This is the best for them and they will be able to grow and thrive, but they can't be here. They can't be in Georgia and Alabama. And then Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which gave the federal government the resources to actually physically take thousands and thousands of Native people from the Southeast to Indian Territory. And yet the stubborn Creeks still wouldn't go. And it took many more years to finally force the Creek people to leave their homelands for Indian Territory. So Andrew Jackson becomes president in 1829. So the Creek leaders at this point know that, they've already been told they have to abide by the Indian Removal Act, but maybe we can negotiate some better terms. And so they went to Washington, D.C. and signed a new treaty in 1832, which allowed them to sell all their remaining lands and move west to Indian Territory. So it ultimately had the same outcome, but there were some negotiations that made this removal treaty not quite as painful as it could have been. yet it was bad. Most people know of the Trail of Tears and associate it with the Cherokee Nation. And that's one forced removal, or actually several. That's the problem, is that we say Trail of Tears instead of Trails of Tears, because it just sort of connotes that there was this like one tragedy that happened. But Nini Stemekida translates to the road of suffering, and that is what removal was characterized by as the Muscogee people. Around 23,000 people ultimately were forced to march west to Indian Territory, most on foot, sometimes on wagons, sometimes on boats. Some were routed through New Orleans. It's a travesty, a history. And if you are looking for a new good book to read, a National Book Award finalist from 2020 is called Unworthy Republic by Claudio Sant. And this is the new Trail of Tears book that everybody's reading these days. And it's outstanding. It's a really wonderful book. But during this time period, there wasn't even really time to camp. They would sort of stop for the night and then wake up and keep walking. And so people who were ill, people who were injured, all of these kinds of vulnerabilities meant that people literally were dying as they were walking. And sometimes they would try to bury people on the, side to the side of the road, but sometimes they weren't even able to do that. So this is one of many different maps that you can find that explores the many Trails of Tears. And maps of this nature are they're not an exact science, right? So, but what I like to just remind people here is that there was this series of marches. They got good at it, and as soon as they could, through the 1830s, most of the 5 tribes had arrived in Indian Territory, which they were promised would be theirs forever, the land that they were assigned there. So the removal, it was very difficult, obviously, for an entire civilization to get back up on their feet after such a journey, but the Creek people managed to do it. There was still tension and animosity between the lower creeks and the upper creeks, and they kind of ended up settling in different parts of the reservation that had been set aside for them. So they were physically separated again. And in fact, even beyond the story I'm going to be telling you today, there were 3 civil wars among the Creek people during the 19th century, not including the US Civil War. So it was clear that tensions, were continuing to be volatile, with one side wanting to maintain, sort of traditional ways of doing things, and the other seeking more assimilation and seeking to occupy settler colonial spaces. So just as basically, as of the sort of eve of the Civil War, the Creek Nation was essentially 2 nations. They were really split in 2. But the reason I do all that backstory is to help demonstrate that, yes, there were Creeks that aligned with the Union, and there were Creeks that aligned with the Confederacy. But the federal troops left Indian Territory immediately, right? They didn't try to stay, and they were needed east, right? And so Indian Territory sort of left to fend for itself, and many Confederate leaders start coming to Indian Territory and trying to sign up the tribal nations in the eastern half of Indian Territory to sign and align with the Confederacy. And so the differences between the North and the South sort of paralleled the Muscogee division, but it was more long lasting. It had been something that had been started a long time ago, pre-removal. So some tribal leaders signed treaties with the Confederacy, and the lower creeks, the more assimilated creeks, actually sent a delegate to the Confederate Congress. So here's Indian Territory. You can see Kansas here on this picture, or this map rather. You can kind of see where things were right before the Civil War broke out. So you see here, what I'm talking about here is the Creek Nation. And so it has this sort of oblong reservation that you can kind of see. It goes all the way across over here. Cherokees are up here in the red. Choctaws bordering Texas over here. Chickasaw. And the Seminole Nation right here, kind of cradled alongside the Creek Nation. So that's kind of what the lay of the land looked like right on the eve of the Civil War. And again, just to give you a little bit more context, a zoom out map to again sort of orient you to where we're talking about here. So this is the Indian Territory, right? So then enters the character that I just found so fascinating, Opothleyahola. I am trying to learn the Creek language and it's not going very well. This is the pronunciation is one of the most difficult things. But this is a fascinating figure, and he died in Kansas, and that's why I wanted to focus on that for this program. So he was born in the Creek Nation, what is today Alabama, and he actually started military service at 15 when he fought in that Creek Civil War and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in the 1810s. He was one of the last to remove to Indian Territory in 1837. He wasn't really a Miko. He wasn't a chief in the traditional sense, but he was a great speaker, and many people followed his lessons and listened to him. He's well known for his long speeches. He supported traditional culture, and another interesting thing that I recently learned is that he actually went down to the Texas border and tried to see about getting land in Mexico. He was not the only Indian to think of this idea, but it just tells you again that the circumstances were intolerable in some cases. And there was a desire to get out from under the United States by any means necessary, right? So he is an interesting fellow, and he ends up in Kansas. So the Loyal Creeks, or what become the Loyal Muscogee, had a lot of animosity towards Georgia and Alabama because they had been forced off their land 30 years earlier. They remained loyal to the federal government, but originally it was, let's just stay neutral. Let's try to stay out of it. We have plenty of problems that we're dealing with here. And so Opothleyahola was advocating for neutrality. But they began to align more directly with the Union as the Confederate forces came into Indian Territory. So there was definitely a split, with the Upper Creeks being the more traditional, and also many Muscogee people with African ancestry, because there had been a lot of intermarriage. They were more inclined to side with the Union as well. The Confederate Creeks, or the Lower Creeks, specialized in cotton production. They ran plantations, and this is in Indian Territory at this time, right? This is not back in the South. Definitely more assimilated. And the Confederacy made a lot of promises to Creek leaders, a lot of promises, including, maybe we'll let you come home. So, and of course, a lot of people didn't fit neatly into one of these boxes, right? There were just a continuum of opinions about what, if anything, the Muscogee people should do during the US Civil War. How would they negotiate it? And again, remember, there's essentially sort of two simultaneous governments operating at this time. So as the Confederate soldiers come in, and as people are being pushed to make a decision one way or the other about alliances, Opothleyahola and his followers decided that they were in danger. And there are a series of letters that were probably spoken by Opothleyahola and written in hand by one of his scribes, but he would write to Lincoln several times during the next few years. And this is the one that has inspired a lot of the literature around this time, is in his letter in August of 1861, you said that in our new homes, this would be referring to the removal treaty, we should be defended from all interference from any person, and that no white people in the whole world should ever molest us. And should we be injured by anybody, you would come with your soldiers and punish them. But now the wolf has come. Men who are strangers tread our soil. Our children are frightened, and the mothers cannot sleep for fear. So he was really desperate for Lincoln to come to bring federal aid and protect the folks that did not want to align with the Confederacy. Just about 3 or 4 weeks later, they did get a response, and it wasn't from Lincoln himself, but it was from a military official that said, you will send a delegation of your best men to meet the commissioners of the United States government in Kansas. And remember, Kansas is less than a year old at this point. And the letter also included, I am authorized to inform you that the president will not forget you. Our armies will soon go south, and those of your people who are true and loyal to the government will be treated as friends. And so relying on that guarantee, there was a move to start going north. So Opothleyahola, the interesting thing about Opothleyahola is that he was fairly wealthy. He actually did own African slaves, but he was on the Union side for many, many reasons. So he forms a caravan of about 7,000 to 10,000. The numbers are kind of hard to tack down, but a caravan of thousands of wagons and people walking. And these caravans stretched for miles. And so he's seeking safety from the Confederacy, but they keep coming at him. And so between the time that they left and the time they got close to the Kansas border, there had been 3 battles, and essentially they were wiped out. They were decimated. But a few people survived, and the next part of their journey would be 14 days of trying to find the Kansas line to cross it. In the snow and the sleet. It was very icy. That's why they talk about the trail of blood on ice. People had no footwear. People might not have had clothes. The letters that were written by people who observed this are very graphic. And many people simply froze to death in this effort to reach Kansas and hopefully safety. This is a military map, which I'm not used to seeing, but if you are interested in this, this tells you kind of where all the major battles were among the Native people and the Civil War, including some of the places up in Kansas that there were fights. This actually came from an interesting little book from a military press called The American Civil War in the Indian Territory. And so this book is more of a military manual of the kinds of guns that were used and some pictures of the different officers and things like that. But at any rate, there are 3, they withstood 3 attacks and barely made it, scattered to the winds in southern Kansas. And they really were. They were scattered. They had run far from the battlefield, especially the women and the children were basically left to fend for themselves with no material goods at all. And then he received word from Leavenworth that the federal troops were actually on their way. And so at that point, they crossed into Kansas on January 15th, just shy of 1 year of statehood for the state of Kansas. So they cross again on foot, many of them without shoes, and extremely cold temperatures, sleet and snow. Their initial stopping point or goal point was historic Fort Row, which was built in 1861. And it's near Fredonia, I believe is the town that we might associate with that down in southeastern Kansas. And this would become the holding camp for the Creek refugees. There were 70 or 80 mounted militia that built this little fort. They were from the local community. They had come as settlers, they had farms, they supplied their own weapons, and they built 3 houses in this little teeny tiny fort with a picket fence. And the Kansas Historical Society has an image, this is on the website, of what this might have looked like. I don't believe this is contemporary, but basically gives you an idea of what we're looking at in terms of what Fort Row had to offer. And now you think of thousands and thousands and thousands of people who need to get to Fort Row. Where are you going to put them? So people continued to die. You know, they tried to feed them. They tried to get materials. It was amazing. One time, a whole wagon load showed up of just women's underwear, and everybody was starving, and nobody could figure out why this wagon had shown up. They also, any food that was deemed unfit at Leavenworth, they sent it to Fort Row. And so people started getting very sick. So you combine the elements, a smallpox epidemic at one point, consumption or tuberculosis, all centered around this very sad little fort in Wilson County, Kansas. So back to the McBride book, which I recommend as a good starting point. The way she phrased it, and she was, I think she was a citizen of Wilson County, was just fascinated by this history, led her to write the book. But she, went to the archives and looked at old newspapers, and she argues that many soldiers who saw the horrors at Fort Row in 1862 went on to fight in the Civil War, but they would never see again the incredible anguish of a people like the refugees that winter. So the Civil War was paled in comparison for some of these fellows who were trying to do the best they could. So the stories are pretty graphic, and she quotes a lot of the specific things that were happening, but you can imagine, amputating the limbs of children. I mean, it was absolutely wretched. There was no food, there was no clothing, and people were continuing to die throughout the winter. And a local businessman in his memoir wrote that the condition of the refugees was wretchedness most complete. So by February 1862, Opothleyahola sent another letter to Lincoln, basically outlining all of the tragedies that had come to them. Our people have suffered a great deal. Many of them have frozen to death. There are now 6,000 women and children in southern Kansas without tents, with very little clothing, and exposed to all horrors of a severe winter. So then it became a question of, well, now what? We've survived the winter. What are the next steps? The federal government wanted to move the camp from where it had landed at Fort Row near Fredonia, and they wanted the Creeks to move to Leroy, Kansas, which I believe is in Coffee County. And it wasn't that far away, but they wanted to close Fort Row, so they told the Creeks and their allies. There were a lot of other tribal members from other tribes that were also at this point part of the contingency, and they had to walk, I think, the 30 miles and relocate. So they closed Fort Row that point. But Opothleyahola was like, I'm not moving. This is good. We've got a good thing going here. I'm tired of moving, and this is where I want to be. So then the question becomes, do we try to return to Indian Territory, or do we stay in Kansas? And this was the quandary from the summer through the fall of 1862. There were a couple of attempts, at least my understanding is there were a couple of attempts for Union troops to try to accompany the loyal Creeks back to Indian Territory, but they either got caught and moved back north, or they and then sometimes when they would get close to the Creek Nation, the loyal Creeks would realize that there was nothing left for them, that all their farms had been burned, that all their possessions were gone. And so the question then was, do we break our heart by going back, or do we break our heart by going back to Kansas? Meanwhile, the relationship in Wilson County between whites and natives was getting very dangerous. There were a lot of skirmishes, disputes. all kinds of challenges within that local community. And so finally, October of 1862, Opothleyahola moved to a refugee camp in northern Kansas at the Sac and Fox Reservation, and that is as far north as they would go. He didn't want to return at that point. The war was not over. He didn't see a future for he or his people back in Indian Territory, so he chose to die on another tribe's reservation. So he died on March 22nd, 1863, in Osage County. They actually brought his remains back to southern Kansas, southeast Kansas, where he first started to try to establish a life in Kansas. So he was brought back and buried there. So I just think, you know, I grew up in the Kansas public schools in Wichita in the 1970s and the 1980s. I don't think we learned much about Indians at all. I certainly never remembered hearing this story of any in any way, shape, or form. So I think it's a really unique aspect of Kansas history that that needs to be more talked about. It. There is a sign, I believe this is at Fort Row, or sorry, Coyville, Kansas. There's a marker that tells the story. And then in 1995, a lot of historians and bureaucrats worked together, and there's actually on Highway 75 down in southeastern Kansas, there is a marked Opothleyahola historical trail, and it's basically 75, and there's different places to stop. And there's I believe there's a way of getting the map and sort of following the trails as much as possible, but it's largely Highway 75 through those southeastern counties. So that's one way that people may know about it as well, because there's the brown signs on the side of the highway. So this has been sort of a sad story. So I wanted to end by bringing another personal perspective into this, and that is the case from almost 2.5 years ago now, where the Creeks won their reservation back again. And this was a huge deal, and I had a small part to play in it by writing an amicus brief with a fellow Cherokee attorney named Mary Catherine Nagel. Basically, the case, we're jumping ahead now, like 150 years, but I just want you to see the tenacity of the Creek people in particular. So at the end of the Civil War, the Confederate and the Union Creeks had to sign a peace treaty, and there was an effort to say, let's kind of put the past to be the past and create a government again. And so then that government entered into a treaty with the United States, which is a concession treaty because the US sort of treated the whole tribe like a former Confederate state. But in that treaty, they wrote the words that the new reservation, the smaller reservation, will be forever set apart as a home for said Creek Nation. And that word forever was actually interpreted by Justice Neil Gorsuch in this amazing decision in July of 2020. So because of that word forever, and because of other instruments in federal Indian law that require a treaty, treaty to be, basically, let me back up, getting myself confused. So Congress can abrogate a treaty according to the US Supreme Court, but they have to be specific and explicit about it. They can't just will it away. And so statehood, it was thought, Oklahoma statehood in 1906 was thought to be the permanent home of the Creek Nation, and a lot of concessions were made. Forever, how long is forever? Well, Oklahoma had decided essentially and started acting at statehood like none of these reservations existed anymore. That somehow statehood had magically erased these tribal nations from the continent. But in fact, in 2020, the Supreme Court determined that that word forever meant what it said, that there had been no explicit act of Congress otherwise, and therefore the Muscogee Creek Nation continues to have its reservation boundaries as recognized in the Treaty of 1866. Tribes rarely win like this in the Supreme Court, so it was a pretty big deal, and I just got my first book treatment of it today called A Promise Kept, the Muscogee Creek Nation and McGirt versus Oklahoma. So that's my presentation. I'm excited to talk to some of you. Maybe you know more about this issue than I do. But thanks for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was awesome. We already have a ton of questions rolling in, so we are going to keep you busy. First off is a question if you've read something. Chief William McIntosh, Muscogee Creek Warriors, 1777 to 1825. You have.
Yes, I relied on that book quite a bit. I recently did an introduction to a republication of the first Creek laws that were written down anyway. Or at any rate, the University of Georgia has the resource, and I wrote a new intro for it. And I relied heavily on that book. Yeah.
Awesome. Next question asking if anyone will have access to the slides. For one, we do archive these on YouTube, so you can always go back and refresh your memory.
Yes, and I mean, I'm happy if somebody needs to use my PowerPoint slides for something they're doing. I have no problem sharing them. So you just email me at KU. You can just Google Sarah Deer at KU, and you can find my email address. The title and who's the author of the book about Indians that mentioned weapons, etc. So this is a very thin little book that I got on Amazon from Osprey Press, OSP. I guess I could type an answer here, right?
Oh yeah, that would be, yeah, awesome.
Okay. So I answered that one. It's called The American Civil War in the Indian Territory by John Spencer, Osprey Press, that publishes military history. Have you ever come across any list of the Muscogee refugees that made it to Kansas? I have seen reports that give aggregate numbers, but I'm very interested to know if there are lists of refugees by name who made their way. I have been trying to find that out myself. And again, you know, not having the skills of an astute historian, I'm sort of left to see what Library of Congress has posted about this time period. But I would like to do a deep dive at some point and learn more about, did any people stay? Ultimately, Creek people were in Oklahoma again, or in Indian Territory again, but I don't know if any stayed.
This next question I'm very interested in hearing. Yeah, so do you have a suggestion on how we
I have a lot of suggestions.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, well, how can we facilitate truthful Native history in curriculum?
Yeah, well, first of all, there are a lot of politics against doing it. I mean, it's considered like, to talk about a treaty, you know, someone might think is critical race theory or something. But I certainly didn't learn any of this growing up. And granted, I'm 50 years old now, but it's really hard to find curriculum sometimes. And I will say that I found, I did a Kansas History Day on this topic, sort of, for Washburn University back in January of last year, I think. Yeah, last year. And I talked about, you know, some of the sanitizing that goes on, especially with state historical societies. And I found a lot of curriculum that's still live on your website that is really problematic. And it suggests that Kansas was sort of like this blank page that nobody had ever touched before. And so there were even little games for children that talked about how you can be a settler, and you just have to, you know, go to this place and then jump on the wagon and you get your land. So it's a constant battle. I would say that I lived in Minnesota for about 15 years, where I started teaching in a law school there. And I will say the Minnesota Historical Society in particular, although there are many still detractors, I think has done a tremendous job of building bridges and trying to right the wrongs of the Historical Society itself. And so that's one state that I would look to. I think that obviously not everyone agrees, right? That's part of the problem, is how do we portray this history?
Right. In our in one of our talks with Dr. Alex Redcorn, he kind of advocated for looking at the state standards themselves.
Yeah.
Would you think that's an avenue that's worth exploring?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think anything is necessary at this point. I mean, now, you know, suddenly when we win the reservation back in 2020, it's like they don't like us when we're a tribe. They don't like us when we're not a tribe. Like we can't seem to win here. But the Creek Nation is is a functioning government. It has 3 branches of government and is astute, you know, as any city could be in terms of governing itself. What role did allotment play? This is another question from Dr. Martin. What role did allotment play in the process of Oklahoma acting like the Muscogee Nation no longer existed? Definitely played a huge role, right? It was wrapped up in statehood. It was an effort to sort of, especially after oil was found, right? To try to divest the Indians of their assets, and an allotment, which was the sort of parceling out of individual farmlands to each individual Indian, each individual Creek, then the rest of it became surplus. And that's when all the white settlers, called the Sooners, came into Oklahoma and started settling on reservation land. So that definitely did play a role as well. Okay, we're done with the tribes. We wrap that up. They're going to assimilate, and we're just going to continue to operate as a state without any recognition of the treaty or even those statehood documents themselves. So I would say, when the state of Oklahoma argued before the U.S. Supreme Court that the Treaty of 1866 had been violated, and it was clearly violated, they made all these arguments, right? Well, look at what statehood did. Look what allotment did. Look what, shutting down their schools did. Essentially bragging for a course of 30 minutes about everything that the state of Oklahoma had done to destroy the Creek Nation, everything. And there was no sense of empathy. There was no sense of compassion. It was really hard to hear the kinds of things they said. But yes, they said essentially these tribes went away 120 years ago. And it's ridiculous that they would want to be, recognized again. And it was Gorsuch, right, which people associate with conservatism, but he's a really conservative reading of treaties, right? So he brought his astute treaty reading prowess to the case and wrote us back into existence in a sense. What else do we have? Yeah, a lot of people who know a lot more about some aspects of this have some really good questions for me. So thank you for those comments. Yeah, there's so much you have to leave out, Each one of those slides could be like a semester long course in college. Oh, somebody's interested in the C versus the K. Yeah, I leave those fights to the linguists. But the C sound in the Creek language is usually a ch. So when you see Muscogee spelled with a C, and you're thinking about the Muscogee language, it would sound like Muscogee. So there's a K that people want to insert back in there, but I don't know all the linguist stories. And yes, the Upper and Lower Creek people did eventually reconcile. It took a long time, and by the turn of the century, just as things seem to be looking up, then statehood happens. Somebody asked about Woodson County and where this person is buried. I'm not sure. And then somebody else said that he might have been moved to Oklahoma. So I do not know the answer to where he is currently buried. I'm sorry, there's one question I don't understand, so I won't be able to answer that one. Great comments and questions. I don't know the answers to all of them. I'm just sort of, like I said, this is my this is my hobby, not my trade. I spend most of my time teaching law students. And so this foray into history has been really exciting for me and really compelling. So I do appreciate very much the opportunity to speak and for KHS to invite me here. I do think some of your curriculum needs to come down.
I would
And
personally, I'd love to have that discussion with you
yeah.
if you have the time.
Yeah, absolutely. But Alex Redcorn is a genius and knows way more about this than I do. So if you're already
He's a
working
busy
with him, then
guy.
you're way ahead of me.
Yes. Okay. Well, we had some great questions here. Awesome presentation. We definitely brought out a lot of experts, which is always great. Um, so I want to thank you again, Sarah, for coming out tonight. We all learned a lot, and I hope everybody can join us again next month. Also Wednesday, February 8th. 6:30 to hear David K. Randall talk about Barnum Brown discovering the first T-Rex fossil and how that forever changed the world of paleontology. So from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thank you all so much for